So, John, thank you for speaking with me. Thank you for helping preserve some metal history. Is it safe to say that you're the only person who worked with both the show Murphy Brown and the band Mercyful Fate?
I believe so, yes. Yes.
So, did you have that parallel existence going for a while where you were this metal guy but working on these majorly mainstream successful shows?
Yes. I was dabbling in heavy metal and the whole club scene, and I was working my way through television and film out here in Hollywood.
So, how did you find your way into the metal scene?
It was just a passion of mine growing up as a kid. And for some reason, in the late 60s, I was attracted to the heavier sounds. And that just grew into out of the Kinks into Black Sabbath and Deep Purple, Led Zeppelin. And then I wanted to be different, so I discovered Blue Oyster Cult because they had a ME-262 airplane on one of their album covers, and I was a big I don't know, I hate to say fan, but I was very aware of World War One, World War Two history, and so then I became a Blue Oyster Cult fan. And then after that,
Got it.
it turned into me going to a record store looking for an REO Speedwagon record because they had opened up for Blue Oyster Cult in '75, and I'm in this eclectic record store, and I hear uh, the second Scorpions record playing over the sound system, and then I became a Scorpions fan, and then I tracked back to UFO, so that was UFO, Scorpions, Judas Priest, and then bumping into the new wave of British heavy metal at the same record store, and then I discovered all that other gold that was coming out of England in the late '70s.
Wow. Okay. So there's a lot of new wave of British heavy metal, of course, but also Blue Oyster Cult, and that's what basically makes up Metallica's Garage Inc. album. And the way that you and I were connected, story that you are is do I have it correct that you are who connected Lars Ulrich and Metal Blade Records?
I connected Lars Ulrich with Brian Slagel before there was James Hetfield and before there was a Metallica. And I met Lars on December 22nd, 1980 at a place called the Country Club, which was a great venue to
Hmm.
see the Michael Schenker Group tour. And that was a wonderful event. And I was out in the back parking lot after the show with my sister and just looking around. There's about 100 people. And I saw a little guy about
Hmm.
50 yards away in a white shirt looking down at his feet and hanging out around some guys, but he didn't really was talking to him. And then he turned out a little bit and I was looking at him and then he turned away and then he turned back out and he had a S on his shirt with a dagger going through it. And I said, F, Diane, I got to go talk to that guy. He's got a Saxon t-shirt on. And I thought I was the only person in LA that knew who Saxon were because I was the only guy that I knew and that was getting into this new wave of British heavy metal. So I went right up to this guy and I looked down at him and I said, you like Saxon? And he looks up and he goes, you know who Saxon are? I said, yeah. And he starts flipping out. I was the first guy he had met in America that knew anything about the new wave. So he starts rattling off, who else do you know? And I said, well, I just picked up the new Angel Witch single. And he turned about white. He was flipping out. I'm dropping Angel Witch. We're talking Bow Wow. We're talking obviously Saxon, Iron Maiden, Trespass, just other bands. And so we connected right away as Beavis and Butthead and new wave of British heavy metal guys.
So he's always been known to be a real. I heard later rumors he's an Oasis diehard and he wanted them to play at his wedding. But uh, do you think that there's anything wrong or commonly misstated about the early days of Metallica and Lars and all that? And it's fine if the answer is no.
Not that I know. I mean, Lars was a true metalhead, head-banging guy, but he also had a lot of European sensitivities. I mean, we used to talk about the Sweet a lot, and he used to always tell me that the Sweet albums over here weren't the albums over there because they were rearranged. So, and he and his family, his mother and dad were obviously into softer music, so he had the European sensitivities. So I don't, not that I know of, but Lars was a Lars was a pain in the ass. I mean, he basically, in a good way, but that mentioned record store, which I first discovered in 1975, the REO Speedwagon and Scorpions and UFO, was a place called Moby Disc. And this guy who worked there named
Hmm.
Dana was my kind of connection to get stuff. Well, Moby Disc then moved to Sherman Oaks. And when I met Lars, he would come up from Newport Beach and we just scour the record stores. And one day, Dana I was talking to him. He says, "Please don't bring in that annoying Dutch guy. He's a pain in the ass." Because I said, "Well, he's from Denmark." And Dana goes, "I don't care." But he always would want to go in the back room. He wanted to know what has been ordered, when's it going to be there. I mean, Lars was obsessive, but so was I. We were both obsessed about this new wave of British heavy metal.
And then how did you first encounter Brian Slagle for Metal Blade?
Well, Brian Slagle, there was no Metal Blade, and I met Brian a month before in November of 1980. Again at Moby Disk, there was this little fanzine, little pocket-sized thing, and in there was an ad for a guy who was doing tape trading.
Hmm.
And he had everything from the Quick to ABBA to whatever, but then mixed in there was like Live Scorpion, 79 France, or Judas Priest, and this is the dark ages. You don't hear this stuff until you get your hands on a hard copy. So I had gone out to Brian's house, and he actually had gotten the Iron Maiden album. So he was dabbling in the new wave, but he was just dabbling into anything that could make him money because he was working as a sales rep at Sears selling
Sure.
microwaves. So I
Wow.
brought I
Okay.
brought I brought Lars came out to my parents' house either just before Christmas or right after Christmas, and we headbanged, for a couple days, and then in early January '81, Lars drove up from Newport Beach, which is a long ways away, and I lived in Studio City, and then I drove us out to Brian, who lived out in Woodland Hills. It was a long ass journey for Lars, so that's when he first met Brian.
And this ultimately led to Metallica being on that initial Metal Blade compilation, which also featured Rat, correct?
Yes, it did. Correct. Um, it was the Metal Massacre came out of the New Heavy Metal Review, which
Hmm.
was a fanzine that Brian came to me in like May and said, "Hey, I'm going to be writing this. Let's do something like Kerrang!" So he initiated it, and I didn't like writing. I was a C student in English. That was horrible, but I was passionate, so I forced myself to write. So I wrote in at least a couple articles in every one of the videos. It was probably the summer of '81. Brian goes, "Hey,
Hmm.
let's summer or fall, somewhere in there." He goes, "Let's do a Metal for Mothers record of LA bands." Metal for Mothers was one of the first compilations that came out of England, and so we started going around to clubs and finding bands that we liked. And I
Hmm.
was in charge of how to make a record, and Brian was took over the typesetting and studio time, and he was now working at Oz Records, so he could also import new wave of British heavy metal. And so through Oz, he met other people, engineers, and he was able to work out some of the nuances of how do you make a record. And I opened up my parents' Yellow Pages and found a place in Burbank. Where do you make a record? So this is just all passion. We learned based on what budget we had that we had to get a recording from each band on quarter-inch tape so then they could master. So I put in $1,200. Brian put in $1,200. We had a budget of $2,400. We started this record label. Brian wanted to call it Skull and Bones, but somebody else was using that title on something else. He says Metal Blade Records, and I said, well, let's call it Black Metal Records. And this is before black metal. This is just me saying, well, this is metal music and the vinyl's black. That's a simple thing. But he
Right.
like, yeah, it was
Simple, yeah.
simple, but he wanted Metal Blade, so I deferred. During this period, Lars had come over one day in early May of 81 with his new friend he had just met, a guy named James. And so met James, and James grew up in Norwalk Downey, which is fairly close to my world. And so James was more into American heavy rock, Aerosmith, Cult, Blue Oyster Cult, Nugent, that kind of stuff.
Motley Crue.
Well,
Later on, we'd find out.
yeah, because the Valley Crew were coming up too. So we bonded over that, and he got a good meal from my mother, spaghetti meatballs or steak or whatever. So we were hanging out at the house, and soon after that, Lars decided he was going to go to Europe. So he just one-way ticket to Europe because he wants to see this new wave thing going on. And he takes off, and a few weeks later, the phone rings, and it's Lars, and he's calling from Sean Harris's house. I said, yeah, right. Yeah, I'm with Sean Harris from Diamond Head. And you want to talk to him? And he put Sean Harris on the phone. And it's like, oh my God, I'm talking to Sean Harris from Diamond Head. And Lars just he can make things happen. It was just ridiculous. He was very tenacious. Getting to the fall of '81, Lars is back after hanging out with Diamond Head, Motorhead, and whoever else. And he calls me. He goes,
Mhm.
I hear you're doing a record with Brian. I said, yeah. He goes, I want to be on it. I said, you don't have a band. He goes, well, I'm going to start something with James. Can I have a slot? Can I have a slot? And I said, yeah, I'll give you a slot, but we'll talk about the music because I had my brother and sister's band on there, and Brian and I were kind of sharing some responsibilities of bands and all that stuff. And then I promised Lars a slot. I said, just call Brian and make sure it's okay with Brian. He calls Brian. Brian says, yeah, whatever. And then Brian tells me, you just deal with him, because it's Lars as being, whatever. And so that's how Metallica ended up on Hit the Lights. And as time went on, because I knew the song was going to be fast and gritty. I think I heard one version of it at rehearsal over at Ron's house in Downey, and I said, I'm going to give you the last slot. It's going to be the fastest song, outgoing. We got to leave an impression. Do some kind of an explosion at the end, thinking like a concerto like Bach or Beethoven at the end of a major performance, and or Judas Priest, the Hell Bent for Leather finale at the end of a 1980 concert or whatever. So they did
Yeah.
do it. They did do an explosion. If you hear the very first version, there's an explosion at the end, and what that is they took the amp head and just threw it on the ground. And so you get the reverb tank from vibrating, but that was the explosion, throwing the amplifier on the ground. So that's how it happened. And of course, if you heard the $50 story, right?
I haven't heard the $50 story, but before I get there, did the $2,400 budget stick?
Yes.
Okay. So I want to hear the $50 story.
Except the $50 story.
Okay.
That's where we get it. So the day of mastering, it was an 11 o'clock session. I remember that morning I had 3x5 cards. My sister's making Brian and I pancakes, and we're arranging, the placement. Steeler has to go first. Rat gets to go here, whatever. Pandemonium's over here. We get down to Bijou Studios on Coenga and Sunset. Sessions at 11. It's about quarter of 11. We still don't have the Metallica song. Lars was racing up from Newport Beach in his mom's 1975 brown Pacer to bring it to us. I've got all the tapes,
Sure.
quarter-inch tapes in a red delicious apple box because I used to work in a produce department and had Hughes Market. So Lars shows up at about 10 of it was about 10 of 11. He's all panicky and running and running and running. And Brian goes, and Lars is standing in front of us, and Brian goes, "Where is it?" And Lars pulls out a cassette out of his back pocket. And Brian says, "Okay, well, where's the $50?" And what had happened is that Lars has said he was recording on cassette and telling me, and I said, "Well, talk to Brian because he's booking the studio time. I don't know what it's going to cost to transfer. You had to transfer to quarter-inch."
Right.
So he pulls out the cassette, and Brian goes, "Where's the $50?" And Lars goes, "I thought you're paying." Brian goes, "No, I told you you're paying." And they start arguing for like 30 seconds. And then all of a sudden, Lars's head cranks over to me. And it's like, dude, you got to have $50. Please, do you have $50? And this is 1982. There's no ATM machines. There's no anything other than cash. And that
Yeah.
morning, I just grabbed all the cash that I had. So I didn't even know. So I pull up my wallet, I look in there, and I had $52 in my wallet. So I gave Lars the $50, and the cassette was then transferred to quarter-inch, and then he got on Metal Massacre. And my feeling is that James probably, if Lars had come back empty-handed, James would have gone in a different direction because James really wasn't into
Yeah.
Lars' personality and his playing. But as James always says, well, he had a slot. He had a slot on a record, and the fact that he had a slot on a record kind of was the glue to get them started. And so like even Lars will say with the what ifs, so that's the $50 story.
Yeah. That's a great story. And the compilation, people primarily talk about it because it had Metallica. Now, it had Rat on it. It had Steeler, which is the band that gave Yngwie to the world
Yes.
in some incarnations of Steeler. So it's such an important compilation. It makes me and a lot of people go, what would have happened to heavy metal had that one compilation not existed? What do you think about that?
It might have gone in a very different direction because that was the impetus. And that also, I think I think it spurred a lot of bands even to get excited about, hey, I can be on a record, and maybe even bands coming to LA. Because the word got out really fast. I was really surprised how popular it was because I thought a lot of the songs weren't very good. I was not, Sirathungal, Demon Flight, Pandemonium. I was like, okay, Rat was cool. Metallica's cool just because it's gritty. Steeler because they were friends of mine. Avatar was interesting being my brother and sisters, but it's like, but wow, it was just this we can do it over here too. So I think it was a huge influence because prior to that, Mike Varney had what was it called? US metal, but that was more like neoclassical guitarists and stuff. And
Yeah.
but here you had metal bands or pseudo metal bands or rock bands. So I think it was huge because right away Metal Massacre 2 was already fomenting in Brian's brain, and he had plenty of submissions and stuff. So looking back now, I've realized the impact. I mean, there's the Metal Massacre documentary that just came out, and it's pretty amazing that this little project that we did just because we were passionate has turned into such an iconic event. And
So,
before
so
and
you helped. Oh,
before I
yeah.
forget, if you ever want to do a podcast about Steeler and Yngwie, I'm the guy because Yngwie moved in with me right after he joined Steeler, so I've got a lot of insight there too.
To be continued about that and Al.
Okay.
A lot of people, when they talk about early Metallica, they go to Megaforce, and Megaforce got a lot of chances because they were there for early Megadeth, Anthrax, etc. For you, what was the line in the sand to go, I'm going to be a metal fan as opposed to a person trying to make a living out of metal?
Great question. I had graduated from college in '82. I was a radio, television, film major and got involved in doing the whole Metal Massacre thing. Brian and I traveled to Europe to promote Metal Massacre, came back, and then we did I think we did the second pressing, and then we signed a distribution deal for Metal, was it Metal Works for a little bit, and then Brian got the rights back because the guy he didn't like the way Brian didn't like the way the guy was doing the distribution. I think right about then Brian said to me, "Do you want to be involved in Metal Massacre too?" But at that point, I didn't really like Brian's music taste that much. I think Brian was more into it for the music, and I was kind of a passionate snob. I was a huge Uli fan, Michael Schenker, and I just was more music snob. And to be honest with you, Brian was not paying the bands on time and bands were coming to me for money and I wasn't controlling the money and I don't like owing people money. So I just said, I don't want to be part of this. So I kind of said, nah, I'm okay. I'm going to start pursuing the TV career, which took a couple more years to go. And then soon after that, Yngwie shows up and then all of a sudden I'm hanging out with Yngwie for 5 or 6 months. So yeah, that was just kind of it for me. It was music and owing people money. And Brian, I think, was already putting money aside for Metal Massacre too. But I just didn't want to be part of that. My mom didn't raise me that way, or my dad.
Did you get the $50 from the mastering session back with the first royalties that came in?
I never got any money at all out of Metal Massacre, nor did I get the $50. No, I didn't see a penny. Never a penny. Nothing.
Wow. Okay. I mean, that's kind of commonplace for the business where generally the hard likely you got paid for it. And there's no union benefits the way that film and television have when you're at the higher level. But it doesn't sound like you're this bitter person who has regrets.
No, it just I was a 22-year-old. I was a 22-year-old kid. I was passionate, and I just had this helping nature. I was a Cub Scout, Boy Scout, and I don't know. I didn't, I never asked for any money ever. I mean, Brian was always generous when I go visit Metal Blade. Here's some CDs. Here's this or that, which is fine. In my mind, it was just something that took off, and I was part of it. And so now, 40 plus years later, I'm thrilled that I was part of it, and the Kornarens name is attached to that, and that can, that like you are preserving the history, and that can go down, hundreds of years from now because no one's going to be talking about Poison. They're going to be talking about Metallica. Yeah, yeah, and there's a documentary coming out called Metallica Saved My Life, and I think I'm in that. So, that kind of stuff is more important to me. Again, it was just out of passion and just it was just a project. So I'm fine. It's sure if Brian wants to give me 5% of the company, that'd be great. But I don't see that happening. So
You mentioned Metallica Saved My Life, which is showing this year at Tribeca, which means it gets the A-list treatment, which is fantastic, and that you're in that, which is fantastic. Now, it sounds like Metallica always the members acknowledged your existence. That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I mean, in early, absolutely. I would always call Lars and just talk to him, check up on him. Um, After Cliff died, I drove up and stayed at Lars's house, and I with James and Jason soundproofed Lars's garage where they did garage days. And I wish I had pictures, but I just never took pictures because I didn't have a camera and I didn't even think about it. But I remember spending the whole afternoon with James and Jason just soundproofing the garage. Lars never got his hands dirty. He was inside. He had an excuse or something, you know. But Jason had his tool belt, you know, and a couple hammers, and so I've always stayed in touch with him and interact with him. About 1991, when the Black Album took off, then Lars kind of became an enigma, and then he was unreachable for 10 or 15 years. And I just done. I don't, you know, I'm not gonna chase after my friends or whatever. And then I ran into him at 2010 at an Iron Maiden concert, but actually I was with Brian, and then I kind of reconnected with Lars, and he's always been nice. And then I went to Record Store Day up at Rasputin's in 2015. Then went to the old house that I used to go to up in El Cerrito. Because that was one of the things when Lars moved to San Francisco and he was running out of money, he called me and he would go, "Okay, I'll sell you the Iron Maiden Prowler, you know, Maggie Thatcher Uncovered, record or something." So I'd drive up and I would buy some of the records I always wanted that he had, and I had records he wanted. And then he gave up his record collection to keep the band going on his end. So then he would
Wow.
yeah, I'd drive up
The
there. That's where I first met Cliff Burton and stuff. Yeah.
the reason I asked about did you still talk to them? Did they still acknowledge you? Is because one of my favorite bands, who I think is on a comparable level to Metallica's Van Halen, and
Sure.
the way that Van Halen is splintered, the people who were there in the early days eventually became persona non grata because the band went, oh, they were disloyal because they did one interview and they talked about the backyard days and all that. But it sounds like Metallica has always been fan friendly. This acknowledged the past, and at the core of it was that they were rock fans.
Rock fans and Kirk Hammett and I, of all things, have a good relationship. I'll text him when he gets a cool guitar like the Michael Schenker Flying V, and I'll praise him on that. So it's great that I can still kind of guitar geek with Kirk. When they played here in 2023, what's the instrumental Call of Cthulhu or whatever that song is?
Cthulhu, I think it is.
Yeah. And I'm in a
Yeah.
snake pit and they're playing it. And Kirk actually sees me and he yells, "John," you know. And so, you know, it's like here I am in the pit with 80,000 people around. So he's cool. James is hard to reach now. I haven't talked to James since 2015. He's kind of aloof. Robert's easy. Lars is cool. So no, it's good now. I mean, it's nice. I hope to be connected, and I plan on being in the 50th show, being there, 50th anniversary show, and it's nice. It's good. Speaking of Van Halen, I used to bag Eddie's groceries, and I used to see him in the backyards out here, and so, and I got Eddie his first Christmas tree in 1980 when he was dating Valerie. That's a whole other story, but anyhow, yeah. But
Wow. So you have better stories than a lot of the people who've written the books, claiming that they have the better stories. That's the compliment I'm giving you, John.
oh, I appreciate that. Thank you. As I say, it just happened. It's just organic. And I feel blessed that I was even around it because I had so much passion for heavy music or heavy rock music or guitar driven music.
A couple more quick questions, and or at least I think they'll be quick questions. And the first one is
Sure.
I saw the ET mug before. I grew up watching ET, and it was a great entertainment news source for my childhood. There is the mug again. Was there ever any overlap for you between ET and metal? And I said because I remember, for example, when Van Halen did their '04 tour with Hagar, that I think one of the exclusives was Entertainment Tonight got that.
Well, I'm a freelance guy. I'm the stage manager. I've probably been with them exclusively for about 12 years. I've bounced around on so many different shows just to survive, like Murphy Brown
Hmm.
Jamie Kennedy Experiment, just everything around. Uh, they've covered E.T. covered Van Halen back in the early '80s. They went up to Eddie's house. There's a famous video of Eddie playing the Bumblebee guitar with Valerie when they just got together, and I've seen all the footage and stuff of that. But I don't, there's probably some. I mean, when I directed music videos when I was working at ABC, I'd sneak into the edit bays at night and cut my videos there. So Yngwie Malmsteen. Well, I did,
Wow.
I did a heavy metal special in 1984 for ABC, and I had Ronnie James Dio came down, interviewed him. I had Yngwie host the show. I had Ron Keel. So I guess there's kind of a crossover because I've used some of the facilities and have an access to equipment, and I just kind of became. I just wanted to do a music video. I just did it. It's not that I made any money at it. I like the Mercyful Fate. That's the other thing. Like with Metal Blade, Brian, like in the late '80s, was kind enough to say, "Hey, you want to? I need someone to direct some videos," because I had done my sister's band Sahara on my own. I had just said I want to do a video, so I took my sister's band and did a video. I think I'd shown it to Brian, so that's why I ended up directing Rain of Fire by Armored Saint and Last Train Home. I did Egypt by Merciful Fate, Bell Witch. I did Haunted Garage. I did a bunch of stuff, but I really wasn't making any money,
Hmm.
and I just was rolling my salary back into the project. So, and then a company approached me to do a rap video, and I tried listening to the song for maybe 5 times, and I said, I can't do this. I can't stand this music, and I can't, so I won't do the project justice. So I just said, forget it. And I walked away from it, and then I just rolled back into Murphy Brown. And of course, Candace Bergen used to tease me about Metallica and my hair. And oh yeah, she used to always rattle me, yeah. What's wrong with you? Why do you listen to that stuff and that kind of thing? I said, well, you were at Monterey Pop. You saw Hendrix. You're lucky. You listen to loud music too. I don't hear you complaining. So,
Yeah, everyone has their roots in that sense. Now, for you, do you have outtakes? Do you have footage from those days?
well, I have plenty of outtakes of Yngwie. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Because I had him host the heavy metal show, and he's even back then Yngwie was a pain in the ass. But I got him to do Eruption, and he kept screwing it up. So I got like 4 or 5 takes. I got him doing all the intros. He kept screwing up the intros. So I've got all that. I also have the only live recordings of Yngwie with Steeler off the board, and I've been sitting on that for years. And I've approached Brian if you want to release it, but it's always, well, Yngwie is a pain in the ass, and Yngwie won't do it. But hey, I want it out there someday because he only played 7 or 8 shows with them, and I've got 2 board recordings, and it's insane. I mean, the guy was ridiculous, in '83, April of '83, and playing. So yeah, so I've got stuff like that. What other outtakes? I mean, I had the famous "Metal Up Your Fucking Ass" tape from Metallica, which was November 29th, '82, which was going to
Mm.
be on that box set that Metallica was going to release in 2015 until Lars and Mustaine couldn't come to terms on songwriting credit. Well, I had the best. I guess I had the best copy, and Lars got wind of it. So they actually sent Greg Feldman to my house with his his tech guys, and they digitized my cassette tape to their system in my living room or in my dining room. So um, I'm sure I've got other stuff, but I don't remember everything that I have, to be honest with you.
Okay, so one more question. You said the name before I could, and that's Dave Mustaine. And I interviewed him one time. It was a cluster, it was not an excellent experience. But then I've heard other people have had wonderful, warm experiences. What the vibe that I get is if you're talking about one of the topics he's interested in, it's the best interaction. And if it's not, and you're catching him at the wrong time, it's amongst the is misunderstood.
I think he's misunderstood. I think he's extremely sensitive. I think he's extremely kind. I mean, recently I saw a video of him holding his grandchild, and you can see the love and the kindness, just like with James. James, I think, is a very kind person and very sensitive. Dave has had to live with the event of being kicked out of Metallica when they were just starting. His songs kind of propelled them up. He was the best musician in the band. I think there were some internal control issues other than just he was a drunk. And I think he knows that stuff. And I don't think he wants to be reminded of that stuff. It's like he even says in that Some Kind of Monster, how do you think it feels walking down the street and somebody's yelling at you, Metallica, Metallica? It's got to be horrible. I've remained good friends with Ron McGovney. And Ron doesn't want to talk about any of this either. I mean, he will talk to me at times when he needs to get things out, but it's rare. But he'll bounce off of me. But other than that, he doesn't want to talk about it because again, it's painful. Because I mean, going from 35 people at their first show and the opening chord, Dave breaks the string on Hit the Lights, to standing with my son watching Metallica perform, and there's 80,000 people. And then there's another 80,000 2 nights later. For me, it's surreal. And I never thought a thrash metal band could become what they've become, but they're not a band anymore. They're a brand. You put an R in band and they are a brand, and they have such great marketing. They're actually giving back so much with their blood banks and food banks, and James is even doing interdiction. I mean, it's amazing what they've turned into, and I couldn't conceptualize something like that, and I know they couldn't back then. But for people like Dave and Ron, it's still got to hurt. It's still got to be what if, And so I think Dave's really now that he's off the drugs and he's gone through the cancer scare. I think he's I haven't talked to him in a while, but I think I could have a wonderful discussion with him. And I think even if it touched on nasty stuff, he'd be okay because he'd be comfortable with me because I've known him since 1983. So, no, wait, 82. What am I saying? No, 81. That's right. 81. Was it 81?
81.
Yeah, 81. Yeah, that's when he and Ron would always fight about Ron's car and stuff like that. So anyhow, but Dave came from a broken family, and so he had a lot of issues, but he settled in, but still living under the whole. It's like Michael Schenker, still always going to be envious and jealous of Rudy Schenker and Scorpions. He just carries that. You carry that, that scar on the shoulder. So
Understood. So thank you for all this excellent history. If you eventually have a book, I think the name of the book should be Got 50 Bucks,
got 50
because
okay.
without those 50 bucks, I don't know where I would be as a fan. I don't know where millions of people would be as fans. So thank you for having those $52 in your. Thank you for your to entertainment, and looking forward to that documentary that you're in that's shown at Tribeca.
If I'm in it, let me know. I hope I'm in it. They're using some of my photos from the whiskey, but yeah, I mean, we'll see. But fingers crossed, right?
Paltrocast.